just put it there, I'll put it on. Member of the board for Conservancy, and very pleased to be moderating this conversation tonight. By way of a little bit of background, I kind of know enough to be dangerous on this topic. In addition to being on the Board Conservancy Board, I'm on the Global Leadership Board for an organization called the World Resources Institute, which is one of the largest think tanks on environmental issues. And at a more localized level, on the Virginia chapter board of the Nature Conservancy. And I have some other reasons to know about this stuff, but that's really not neither here nor there. Really want to focus on the panel and the conversation tonight. So, first of all, I wanted to thank you all for coming tonight, and thank my fellow board members for being here. The organization that we're all here for is doing really incredible work in our community, in the natural landscape in our community, so it's very important. Tonight's panel discussion is both incredibly timely and incredibly important. You know, there really is growing awareness of the role that nature can take in mitigating the worst of the impacts of human-triggered climate change. But at the same time, there's also great concern about the impact that climate change is going to have on nature and biodiversity. And we'll be talking about that intersection. It's increasingly clear that natural systems like forests, soils, and oceans and grasslands play a critical role in absorbing excess greenhouse gas emissions. But the exact role those systems can have in offsetting the future emissions is part of this conversation. And I have to say, we're really honored to have such experienced and knowledgeable panelists to talk about the issue. We're going to go through a bit of a moderated conversation and then maybe open up to a Q&A for everyone. So kind of wrote things in backwards order in here, which is really kind of weird. So I go backwards on my booklet to get to things. But I know some of this mostly by heart because I know both these gentlemen pretty well. So Chandler and Voorhis, right in the middle here, everyone should recognize, and he's recognized, works and lives right here in the plains. But little did you know, the tree in the forest, he's a renowned expert and has been working in these markets, the carbon markets, and restoring natural habitat and valuing natural habitat for 20 years. And working right here in an office just across the railroad tracks. So Chandler's an incredible knowledge base for these kind of work. And I've had the pleasure of working with Chandler on a project. Actually, we did a project together that we co-funded and kind of helped lead, which led to a white paper called Eroding Value, which was on why dirt matters for business leaders and investors. So that was a couple years ago, and it was a fun project to work on. We were learning a lot as we went along. And then Rob Rose has come up from Williamsburg today, where he's the executive director of the Institute for Integrative Conservation at William & Mary, and also a member of the faculty. And he, immediately prior to that, he worked at the Wildlife Conservation Society, and he can talk a little bit about that experience. Rob also has a bachelor's and master's degree in imaging science from RIT, and a PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in geography. So, with that, I'm going to put on my microphone. In the meantime, Rob, you're going to go first. And you're going to talk a little bit. Tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then tell us a little bit about your thoughts on nature-based solutions to climate change.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here tonight, and thrilled to be working on a project at the Board Conservancy with some of our students. You can hear me okay? Yeah. So, Tim asked for us to spend 5 minutes saying why we're here, how we got here, and mine is a confusing story filled with failure and high expectations. And I'll tell you the brief story, but it started when I was a kid. I remember looking through National Geographic and seeing pictures of Diane Fossey working with gorillas and Jane Goodall working with chimpanzees, and I wanted to be a field conservationist. And I got my chance to do it during my PhD. I went to Cameroon to set up a human-wildlife conflict study, and I got a chance to spend time in the forest collecting elephant dung for research. And I found out I hated it. Where was field conservation? And it was really depressing to find this out, because I knew I was never going to realize my dream of being one of those great muddy boots conservationists. But what I did also find is I'm good at sitting in front of a computer with a cup of coffee and the internet. And I found a pathway into conservation conservation geography and being a geospatial scientist, using spatial data to make maps and analysis to better understand the world we live in. And so I really dug into that, and after I finished my PhD, I went to the Wildlife Conservation Society as a conservation geographer. And I spent 7 years as part of a team that traveled the globe, going to our conservation partners around the world. I went to places like Afghanistan and Cambodia and Argentina, really training others how to use some of these geospatial tools to improve conservation outcomes. It was a lot of conservation planning, making maps, looking at land cover change over time, anything I could really do. And it was an amazing 7 years, the best 7 years of my life. But in 2015, an opportunity opened up at William & Mary in the Center for Geospatial Analysis. And it was a center that was designed, similar to my job at WCS, to support the use of geospatial sciences on campus. And I jumped at the opportunity in part because I also love to teach. I love being around students. I get motivated by students, and I'm thrilled to get a chance to be back in the classroom. So I jumped on the opportunity, and then in 2019, myself and my partner, John Swaddle, had a chance to write the proposal that ended up launching the Institute for Integrative Conservation. And we launched in 2020. And that's sort of why I'm here. And so let me tell you a little bit about the ISC very briefly. We have a mission really to train the next generation of conservation leaders around the world. And we do that through a major that we recently launched in integrated conservation, the first undergraduate major in integrated conservation anywhere in the world. We do that by training young conservation leaders around the world. And we do that by engaging conservation partners in projects that matter and letting our students work on those projects. So it's a great opportunity for our students to engage in real-world conservation projects. It enables us to support conservation partners around the world because we focus on projects that matter to them. And we've launched a program called the Conservation Research Program. It's a year-long opportunity for students to work directly with conservation partners on projects they bring us. Thankfully, Tim Dunn has a connection to William & Mary and connected us to Michael and the Bull Run Mountain Conservancy with the project idea of looking at valuing the carbon at the Bull Run Mountain Conservancy to see what that can be used for innovative carbon and conservation financing. We were thrilled about the opportunity. It's great to have a project in our backyard, great to be able to bring students up so easily. And so we launched this actually last semester, or at the start of fall semester. We had 2 students kind of building some of the data needed to run the analysis. And now we've launched into the year-long program with 2 students. One, Aaron, raise your hand. He's our conservation economics student. And we have another student who couldn't make it, who's the data scientist. And so it's a really thrilling project to be able to bring 2 students with very diverse backgrounds to work on this project over the next year. So we're very thankful for this opportunity. And nature-based solutions.
Yeah, well, I'll hold you there.
Okay.
Because that was a great start. And then we're gonna go to Chandler for a minute, and then we'll go back to that, because then we'll get to the heart of the matter.
I will note I tend to ramble, so at any time just
Well, that's why there's a moderator. And I just want to, we'll come back near the end, we'll come back to the project that's being worked on that literally both these gentlemen are involved with. Really exciting, and we can come back to the why and the purpose of that, but we're going to start at the more macro level and focus on the more global issues that we're addressing. So, Chandler, tell us a little bit more about your work, particularly green trees, and then we can go back to the nature-based solutions.
Well, thanks for having me. I feel very comfortable with 2 William & Mary people around me. Both my parents went there. My son is a junior there. My wife went there. So I didn't, but I'm very comfortable with it. I got into carbon markets because of a person most of you will probably know, Maggie Bryant. Maggie was the first chairperson of Environmental Resource Trust in 1996, which was the first private carbon registry in the world. It was a spin-off of Environmental Defense Fund, and we worked on a utility project involving 40 utilities in the Department of Energy back in 1996. And it then mushroomed into Power Tree Carving Company, and we started working through how do you do a carbon deal? What is it? What is it? What's the unit of measurement? How do you define that unit of measurement? And really, those were the early Wild West days of trying to understand how to build a market around this. And a lot of that was going in and acquiring lands in the Mississippi Delta and reforesting those lands, and then selling the underlying land back to Fish and Wildlife Service using Pittman Robinson money, which is what comes from duck stamp money. And then retaining the carbon credits. And we realized that there was a better way to do that, to build a public-private partnership model with the private landowner, and to accelerate this versus having to go out and buy land, because that was just not scalable at the time. We started our company, both Kerry Crane and I are partners. We started our company on, of all days, St. Patrick's Day, in 2003. So we'll turn 20 this next month. Today, I'm proud to say that we've built the largest carbon reforestation project in the United States. We account for 99.6% of all reforestation credits in the voluntary market, and it's the largest voluntary nature-based project in the United States. We've been issued just shy of 6.3 million metric tons. We're going through a number verification right now that will add well over 1 million tons to that number. All total, there's 136,000 acres currently in the project, and we have over 650 different landowners ranging from 7 acres to 3,500 acres. So it's one project, multiple landowners that we add every year. I'm also proud to say on March 10th, I believe it is, Andrew's here in the office, or in the audience with us, we'll be actually planting our first acres in the state of Virginia. All these acres that we've planted to date have been in Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi. We were expanding into Virginia and into the Carolinas. And so as far as the development of where we're going, this is just the tip of the iceberg, and look forward to getting into that in a minute. But I will say the other thing that's taking place in our firm, and in the marketplace, that's very significant, is that we're doing the first ever nature-based auction on the ICE platform. ICE is the owner. Intercontinental Exchange owns the New York Stock Exchange, among other exchanges. And we're doing 500,000 tons on March 30th. We've been in the middle of a roadshow, done over 80 different roadshow events with Japanese trading houses, European and American banks, hedge funds in Australia, corporations in the US and Europe, and in between. And so it's been very enlightening to go through that. And the reason that we are doing that is that the market really needs to lurch forward. We need to standardize the settlement process. We need to create the market education around what these credits are and how they differentiate between each other, and really to create price discovery. Price discovery leads to more higher prices coming from the sale of credits that we then get back down to the landowners. This past fall, we sent down $8.2 million to our landowners, which was about $61 an acre. And that price signal has led to a significant amount of lands coming into that we're going to be planting even next year. So we've got 3 million trees going in the ground right now, and we're expecting that number to go to about 6 to 10 million next year.
That's right. All right, so pretty clear we've got two pretty good experts here. So let's start diving into the meat of the matter. So Rob, first kind of explain to us the role natural systems have in our climate change afflicted world.
Yeah, so that's a great place to start, and it really is at the heart of nature-based solutions. Sometimes you hear different terms, and it's been, from my perspective, a little ill-defined, but to me, it's about letting nature do what it does best, letting it act as the buffer against changes that we see due to warming climate. So a really clear example, mangroves is an important nature-based solution to protect from storm surges. They sit along coastlines, and in places you have mangroves, you have a natural barrier when mangroves get to do what they do best, that's protect the land from these storm surges. Another one that we all deal with here is the heat island effect in cities. So cities tend to be a little bit warmer because the amount of impervious cement that you have in a city. And trees can be that nature-based solution that cool a city. It's trees doing exactly what they do. They kind of suck up heat, they provide shade, and that's the idea of nature-based solutions. Why this matters to conservation is because every time you have sort of a step forward in providing a solution like this, you're protecting the ecosystem. You're protecting the biodiversity that depends on the ecosystem. And you're protecting the communities that depend on the ecosystem services that trees provide, that fresh water provide. And so by protecting it all through this idea of nature-based solutions, you have multiple pathways to healthier biodiversity, better ecosystems, and healthier people living in and around these places.
So, Chandler, we're hearing about all these great values that are really human values, right? Protecting the system. So why do we need to price it?
1/3 of all the emissions that have ever gone up in the atmosphere since 1750 has come from land use change, predominantly deforestation. If we don't put a price signal on nature, then we're really relying on the ethic to protect it. And at this point in time, the only time a tree is shown up on a balance sheet is when a chainsaw hit it. It's been a point of extraction. When you can put a value on a tree as a tree, you change how you optimize and manage land. And that is an important development in terms of reinventing capitalism into the next iteration of itself. And when we can do that, and we can say, is that tree worth more up than down, then we build optimization structures. And those optimization structures, you may still do some timber thinning, but at least you're asking the question. We've never asked the question. And so when we send checks down to landowners, even some landowners have been in the program for a long time, they're blown away. They're blown away because they're used to getting paid when timber leaves the gate and crops leave the field. There's been a point of extraction that's gone off that land. Now we're valuing it as a tree. Is it a perfect value? No, it'll never be perfect value. But it's at least not zero. And that is to send those price signals to landowners to take a different value, to widen the perspective of how we look at land. I'm going to go back to a guy by the name of William Petty in the 1600s. He changed worldwide our view around land. He said, we need to treat land as capital, and to release its value required labor. I would argue today that what we need to do is widen our lens to understand the genius of nature. Because nature is not an offset. Nature is a technology for how we repair the past and recalibrate what we have already put up in the atmosphere. And so when we can do this, we can manage our assets more holistically than just this kind of myopic mindset of extraction.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I want to add one other component of that is this idea that oftentimes when we think about conservation globally, but especially if you take the tropics, the Amazon rainforest, the Central African rainforest, the price of conservation is often borne by the local communities. Communities that can't afford that price, right? They would rather be able to cut a tree down, use extractive components to their livelihoods. And so by valuing the nature, valuing the standing carbon in those forests, valuing mangroves, if you can find that value and actually monetize that, that money can support the conservation at the local level, and all of a sudden those communities are being asked to bear the burden of conservation because it's something that I care about, for example.
All right, so people are probably thinking, all right, this is great. We'll price nature, we'll grow a lot more trees, and we solve the problem. What's the problem with that thought?
There is no silver bullet in this. It's going to take the latest 2 assessment reports from the IPCC has made it very clear that we have to reduce emissions moving forward, and those reductions are gonna come from wind and solar and efficiencies and fuel cell technologies and things that we can't even dream of today. But that's not good enough. We've got to repair what we put up in the atmosphere. So we work with Microsoft, and they've bought for many years from us, and their goal is to not only to get to zero, but to negate all the emissions that they've ever put up in the atmosphere since Bill Gates and Paul Allen founded it in 1975 or whenever it was in a garage. Well, how do you do that? You can't do that through wind and solar. Wind and solar is about being less bad moving forward. So what technology out there repairs the past? Direct air capture, it's only done about 36,000 tons in 20 years. It's billions of dollars. At some point it's going to scale, but it's not there yet. And there was a study I just recently read, and I was telling Tim this and Rob, that said direct air capture using machines instead of trees to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere, to lower the 1 part per million in the atmosphere will require 60% of the world's energy to power those machines. So that's not a silver bullet. Trees are not a silver bullet, but they're all together, they're part of the solution. So we need, it's not a one size fits all, it's this or that. It's really an and plus mindset. And so we need to be reducing, we need to change behaviors, we need to plant trees, we need to save the tropics, we need to do all the above. And that is our best chance of solving this issue.
There's also, I just recently heard about some research to estimate the value of a whale for carbon capture. I don't know if anyone saw this TikTok. I think the estimate was a whale could be worth about $2 million over the life of the whale because they have all this algae on them and it absorbs carbon. And so it's not just trees, it's not just vegetation, it's biodiversity as well. And there's ways to value biodiversity because of the feedback that they provide in terms of healthy ecosystems and keeping this planet and the people that live on it healthy.
So 50 to 60% of all clean drinking water comes from forested ecosystems. So as we go in and start to repair and restore those forested ecosystems, we're cleaning up the water. When we do that, we're also creating wildlife habitat corridors. So we work with the state, work with Virginia Tech to look at how many acres within 300 feet of a perennial stream that flows in the Chesapeake Bay are not in a state of forest, and there's 650,000 acres. So imagine if we went in and planted, whether in grasses or trees, those 300 feet within a perennial stream, the bay would be radically different because we would be buffering all that phosphorus and nitrogen that's flowing into the streams and then into the bay that's causing so much of the issues that we're facing in a very important estuary. But at the same time, it's creating wildlife corridor habitat. And that is huge. So this nexus between water, carbon, and biodiversity is huge.
So that was exactly where I was going to go next, so it's perfect. Rob, talk a little about this intersection between nature and biodiversity, and why does biodiversity matter to humans?
That's a question that can be answered a lot of different ways, and I think it depends on who you ask.
I'm asking you.
Right, and so the answer you'll get from me as a personal response is biodiversity matters because it's part of life on Earth, and I personally feel like we have an obligation to protect life on Earth, and that's why biodiversity matters. But biodiversity matters because biodiversity is what makes these systems thrive and what makes these systems healthy. So if we lose 70% of the biodiversity in a landscape, the system's going to collapse because at all scales, those different species matter. And they matter because the smaller species provide food for the bigger species, the different vegetative types provide shelter and food for other species. Even having rich biodiversity prevents against collapse of species because of disease. And so it's hard to imagine a healthy planet without high biodiversity and maintenance of high biodiversity. so while I feel, I've committed a life to conservation and protecting biodiversity, I think there's a lot of tangible reasons why biodiversity matters. And it directly links to healthy humans and healthy systems. We're talking, I think you mentioned medicine. The amount of medicine that comes out of rainforests is staggering. It's like 70 to 80% of all medications are derived from rainforest products. And so if that biodiversity collapses, we lose the ability to generate new medicines. And so we have to consider all those impacts of a collapse in biodiversity.
I just took your line, so.
I mean, it is a systems approach that needs to be taken with biodiversity, and the medicine is just one example of our reliance. And a lot of people just don't realize that these tropical forests are basically laboratories for the next cure to name a disease. But it's also, it's our connection to our humanity, and most important. And so if we start to lose indicator species, and it just becomes a downward spiral. So the more that we can create and restore forest and to create that habitat for biodiversity to thrive. I work on a project in South Carolina that has the highest concentration of red cockaded woodpeckers, which is a threatened and endangered species on private lands in the country, 92 colonies. The only way to help that species thrive is to create more of those assets, which is longleaf restoration, and that's what we're doing in 2 weeks, the first ever carbon longleaf project, because we need to rebuild these forests. The longleaf got wiped out. What's interesting about the longleaf ecosystem is it's one of the, outside of bottomland hardwoods, it's one of the most biologically rich forests that you can do. But we've also went a step further and looked at what does the longleaf ecosystem mean for climate adaptation issues. And what we have found is that, when we denuded the landscape from the Carolinas down to the Gulf of Mexico, we lost the ability to buffer from these high wind and flood events that go on. And we went back and looked at all the hurricane damage that has been done over like 30, 40 years, and we found that longleaf withstands hurricanes infinitely better than loblolly or slash. They're like toothpicks that break. And so the climate resiliency and what you're seeing with a lot of states as they look at how to shore up their port infrastructure, and they look at the gray infrastructure basically of the coastline and how they're going to deal with rising sea levels. Well, I would argue that longleaf is green infrastructure. And the more that we can do longleaf restoration along our coastlines, the more we're going to help protect them.
So one of the data points I know came out this past year was from the World Resource Institute, and I think this is generally accepted, is that if we didn't have natural systems, the forests, the oceans, grasslands, and soil that were absorbing, we would have overall greenhouse gas emissions every year would be 40% higher. So they're basically absorbing 40% of the emissions we generate. So there's just an inherent incentive just to protect what is there, not to mention increasing it, but it does also raise the point, well then if you're going to offset those emissions, you need a lot more of that nature, and probably more than there actually is on the planet. But that gets me to 30 by 30, which 30 by 30 sounds like a Hitchcock movie. But it's really a target agreed to by the global community. I think everyone's aware of the COP27, most recent climate change, but there's also a thing called COP15, which is on biodiversity and habitat. And at the meeting in December, there was an agreement amongst almost all the participants to set a goal of 30 by 30. So maybe, Rob, you can tell us a little bit more about what 30 by 30 means and what does that mean here in the US?
Yeah, it's a really aggressive goal to protect 30% of all terrestrial areas, 30% of all oceans, 30% of all freshwaters by 2030. And what's really important about it globally is it sets a target, right? It sets something that countries could sign on to and say, we're going to work towards this target of 30% protection. And by setting a target, you set a mechanism to evaluate against. So we're always evaluating how we're doing against that target. It also sets an opportunity to bring more funds to protection, whether it's private land protection through land trust organizations or government level protections through different mechanisms that they have to protect their lands and seas. And so with more money, it just would hopefully stimulate more opportunity for conservation. Certainly when we think about nature-based solutions, it impacts and adds to those ideas of nature-based solutions to mitigate and adapt to climate change. In the US, we weren't one of the signers in the COP15 pledge, but President Biden did, through executive order, launch America the Beautiful. And it's basically launching the 30 by 30 goals for the US. I think it provides, one, some visibility to this idea, and I think that's incredibly important in conservation, having that visibility and having that set target. We have a long way to go, both in the US and globally. I think the estimates are between 12 and 17% I've seen for terrestrial areas protected. We want to get to 30%. Marine is even less, it's 8%. I was just at a marine conference and someone showed a diagram that to get to the marine goal, you need to protect an area about the size of 2 Africas. And so you can just imagine what it's going to take to get to that. But it's an important goal, and part of what we need to do is to train young conservationists to be working in these other areas and find innovative conservation financing mechanisms to support the protection of those areas, because it's very costly. In the US, I think it's going to be done on more on a state-by-state basis. And so what we're seeing are states like California have a very aggressive plan to reach those 30 by 30 targets. I think the challenge, if you take it state by state, is it's not really taking some of the important conservation principles that we think about, like connectivity and what happens across those borders, right? Wildlife don't care about borders, they don't stop at the borders. And so state by state programs to reach 30 by 30, especially when it's going to be sort of patchwork estates, I think will get us part of the way, but not the most important way. That would be designing an entire program to protect 30% of the lands and waters in the US.
30 by 30 and what the Biden administration done is today's modern equivalent of what Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot did. Imagine if they had not done what they did, 100 years ago. And we would not have protected vast swaths of national treasure in terms of our refuges and wildlife preserves. We'd be in a world of hurt if we didn't do it. So the administration stepping up on America the Beautiful and doing a 30 by 30 is the equivalent of what Teddy Roosevelt did 100 plus years ago. And we need to do that. That's a policy driver. And we need policy drivers, but we need market signals at the same time. And we need new mechanisms. And one of the new mechanisms that, by virtue of working with ICE, Intercontinental Exchange, that they have gotten us involved into the development of a new publicly traded company called a NAC, a Natural Asset Company. You've heard of SPACs and some of those other types of publicly traded companies. A NAC is going to be around how the profits are cycled back into a landscape ecosystem restoration or preservation standpoint. So we're going to use the public markets to help speed up the velocity of capital going into these markets at the same time that we're leveraging the arm of government to then take huge swaths of land and say, okay, let's protect this. And so it's going to take that policy driver, it's going to take these new market innovations that's going to help us to reach that goal.
Great, thank you. So we're going to take us from this global conversation about these topics to state level for a second, and then to the local level. And the state level, just as a factoid, as I mentioned, I'm on the Nature Conservancy Board in Virginia, and just you may be interested to know that of all the chapters, every state in America has a TNC chapter, actually some of them combined, but there's 50 of them. And Virginia has the most amount of acres in conservation in total acres to any other state. So we're doing our job. We're doing a pretty good job. But still not good enough. So don't get too excited about it. So now we get to the project we're doing here, and we want to tell you a little bit, give you a little bit of context as to why the project, what we're hoping to accomplish, and kind of some scoping it out a little bit. So just in terms of why we chose as an organization, we thought it would be valuable to go through a process of trying to understand not only the existing amount of carbon sequestered in this area, this community, through all the protected land, protected and unprotected land and forests, but also try to model out the future carbon that would be sequestered if left alone. And that can inform a lot of decision making that we'd all probably be in support of, which is figuring out how it's really more valuable, or at least what the value of keeping it in nature. And also, so when we're thinking about alternative uses for land, that there is an argument to be had for the value of keeping it the way it is, another arrow in that conversation. But also as states and communities start to develop climate action plans of their own, to think about what are we doing in the effort to mitigate the worst impacts from climate change, and what resource do we have? And there's this whole growing field of natural capital accounting, which helps countries and communities figure out the real value of these things, the streams that attract tourists, or fishermen, fisher people, or the forests that just add value through all the things we've been talking about. So that's the why we're embarking on this. And if it weren't for the fact that William and Mary had this funded, projects, we probably wouldn't have been able to do it. We may have been coming to you and asking for some more support, because we think it's really important, but we was very fortunate to have that. So Rob, I'm gonna ask you maybe to scope out a little bit, what the project really entails from your perspective, and kind of how the timeline.
Yeah, sure. And like I said, we're thrilled to be part of this project, in part because understanding carbon financing is such an important, and I think not widely understood. Of course, we have an expert here, but we need more experts around the world to understand how this could work. And we need some experts at William & Mary, so we have two amazing students that are going to help us better understand this idea. And so the project came to us, and it fits into, as I mentioned, our conservation research program. It's a year-long program that engages students with conservation partners to develop these projects on the ground. We usually have about 16 projects a year for about 20 to 25 students, and they're all over the world. And it's fun for students to go all around the world, but it's great to have a project right here working with a team in Virginia. And so the project came to us, and I have a little bit of history working on carbon financing projects through REDD mechanisms, reduce emission for deforestation and degradation. And the idea was you could raise carbon funds through an open and voluntary carbon market if at your conservation site you could say, because we have conservation here, we're avoiding deforestation. And if we avoid some amount of deforestation, we could sell those that avoided deforestation as carbon credits on the market. And the money would be funneled to the conservation organization. And so this goes back to 2010, 2011. And the projects were in part really challenging to develop because the estimate of the value of that avoided deforestation took a lot of time to develop. I focused on kind of coming up with models of deforestation if you didn't have the project there. But then you had to be in the field measuring carbon, digging up soil, burning trees. It's very time and labor intensive. And so the opportunity here was to use some of the geospatial tools and some of the data that are available to us, satellite data, other forms of remotely sensed data and spatial data, to see if we can use that as a way to begin to estimate the value of the carbon at the Bull Run Mountain Conservancy. Aaron is working on the economic side of it, and I think beyond even the carbon, there's other valuations that we should be thinking about, like the value that the forest provides to keep your water clean, or to keep pollution out of the sky, or to keep temperatures cooler. All those other ideas of nature-based solutions that could also be valued. And so Aaron's looking at sort of all the different components that come into evaluating what the value of standing forest is. And so the project just started with these two students. It started in January. They're working directly with Michael. They're writing proposals right now, so they get some experience writing proposals. Over the summer is really when they'll do most of their research, including some field work here, and then write it up in the fall, give presentations on it. Maybe they'll be back here to present on their work on their own. And that's kind of the timeline. It'll wrap up at the end of the year, 2023.
So let me give a different twist on why this is important. And Georgia will appreciate this. 70% of the tax revenue that comes into a county is property tax. And carbon is rooted in real property. But it doesn't show up on the balance sheet of that county. And so about 2+ years ago, maybe 3 now, we amended the Industrial Development Act of the state of Virginia, which is the act that spawns economic development authorities, to allow EDAs to aggregate landowners both from forest and agricultural standpoints for carbon markets. If we can do that, and we can allow counties to be at the forefront of aggregating landowners, and we can quantify the carbon, and the counties get a piece of that pie, and now landowners are getting economics for their natural capital asset, then we don't have to develop the property down the road to pay for yesterday's sins. And when we all know the big monkey in the room when it comes to the county situation is the fact that about also around 60–70% of the county's revenues goes into funding public education, its contribution. And that we use the composite index to then turn around and the state comes up with its next big chunk of money. But when we're dealing with that issue, and that's a zero-sum situation, so one county wins at the expense of another, and it forces our property taxes to go up. But if we put the natural capital assets on the books and create the economics where companies around the world are buying the carbon credits that are being aggregated through an EDA structure in, say, Fauquier County, then we can actually not put the pressure on schools and the infrastructure that's going on in terms of roads and libraries and all the things that go with this. And so carbon finance gets very local and gets very, because it is ultimately rooted in real property. And if you were to take a graph and chart the trajectory of the federal government since post-World War II, or even state governments, they make their money on taxing the velocity of income. And that number is going up like this. But if you look at counties at that same period of time, it's more moderate level. And so the gap is widening between the Fed-state relationship down to the county relationship. And the reason is that counties tax the stored wealth value of real property. But if we can evolve what real property is in terms of ecological markets, then we can bring in new sources of income without putting the pressure on the infrastructure.
So,
Can I add one more thought?
sure, and then we're gonna go to audience Q&A.
I do think my inner tree hugger is coming out. And I think it's important to talk about the beauty found at Bull Run Mountain Conservancy, the beauty in standing trees. And the reason that's so important, and this idea of connection to nature is so important, is the health benefits that are now really recognized and come out of being in and around nature. So imagine a long day of work, you just drove through traffic. How good does it feel to go for a walk in the woods, right? It changes your perspective. But there's significant and tangible health benefits to nature. And so for me, yes, it's easy to see that I value it for personal play, but you can imagine the health cost savings with more nature, with more people getting out to nature, living in and around woods or near wildlife, health costs go down because people tend to be healthier. So I had to add that.
Well, that's a great way to bring it to the audience and see where people want to go in this conversation. Any questions?
Yeah, for those who've always been here, we always like to take questions at the end of all our programs. So if you have questions, raise your hand and we'll just go on board.
How does, we have a big influx of data centers. And how does your economic model compare with the economic model presented by Amazon, where we put this big thing here? It pays you money, there's no school impact. How does your model compare to
I think
that?
the simple answer to that was in the article that said that the Maple Tree Farm opportunity, the owners of that land were offered $950,000 an acre for their land. I think that answers the question. It doesn't.
It can't.
Policy has to be a step in there.
Yeah,
So
that's what.
Yeah, Chandler, can you tell me what you know, or tell us what you know at this point as you value the carbon markets, and they're different in the United States, and the situation's different than where I work internationally, very different. How do you place value on a site that has carbon, might be middle of the road, but it has biodiversity and water and produces other things? So how do you weight the project? And included in that, what's required when you enter into a conservation project, a carbon project like the one that's going on? Do you require a management plan so that creates jobs and creates, what are the other side benefits of participating in a carbon project?
Great question. One, when you're dealing with nature-based carbon projects, carbon is just the currency by which the business deal is getting done. We look at what we call co-benefits. And every project's different. Some may have co-benefits off the charts in terms of endangered species or mangroves when you're on restoration. So we look at the biodiversity, we look at the social economic side of things. In the Mississippi Delta, we're dealing with 6 of the 10 poorest counties in the United States. There's a data layer out there that we use called New Market Tax Credits. It's looking at where the median income is and by zip code. And what we've found out is that for every $1 million that we're putting in the ground, we're generating 39.7 jobs. It's actually, from a reforestation side, it's the highest job creator. Forget about the value of the job. But it's the highest in terms of job generation per $1 million, and this was an MIT study. And that's looking at direct, indirect, and induced jobs. So there's a lot of economics around the folks that you're employing, whether it's foresters, whether it's wildlife biologists, whether it's the planting crews that are coming in. We use a tremendous amount of technology. I was just, prior to this, was talking to Tim and Rob about some of the things that we're doing on the technology side. We just flew all 136,000 acres using a technology stack of remote sensing. And per 200 acres, we're generating 330 million data points per 200 acres. So we're creating digital twins of every tree in the forest. Well, that takes jobs to do, and it takes a lot of processing that's going on. And so across 136,000 acres, it's 220 trillion data points that we're collecting. Well, those data points then get ingested in terms of how we're looking at the co-benefits, because we can see everything. And we can see signatures of wildlife, we can see a lot of other elements to it. And we're using that same data set to run into parametric insurance, where we can start to see what are the risks, the future risks from acts of God around particular properties. And so that, but from a project standpoint, in the voluntary market, the story about that project, so take Bull Run, it's going to be unique to Bull Run. What are the biodiversity things that project's going to protect and that are unique to the project? How much carbon, how fast are the trees growing? And you know, how stressed is it too? Because we can now put sensors on trees where we can measure on a 0.08 millimeters of annual or minute by minute growth of that tree. So we can actually look at like an EKG and look in real time and see that tree grow in the sunlight and see it contract at night. And by virtue of doing that, we can start to see when the tree gets stressed because it's got lack of water, and that informs. So there's going to be a lot of data science jobs around it, in addition to the traditional planting and biology and forestry work.
There's someone else. This has been amazing. Thank you. You touched at the very beginning on economics being kind of an alternative defensive nature to the ethics, and Rob talked about this in the tree hugger, and it reminded me of a legal paper by Christopher Stone called "Should Trees Have Standing?" And it's this idea that rights should have nature in and of, or nature should have rights in and of itself. Right now, when we damage the Chesapeake Bay, the only way we can recoup damages from companies that pollute is because those damages impact our economy, they impact people. But what about the impact it has on the Bay? What role do you think the rights of nature could play in this effort to protect the nature we have while you work to restore it?
This is a topic that is, the thing about carbon is it's not the end of the road, it's the beginning of a long journey. And what you're talking about is part of what's going on that journey. It's not just carbon for carbon's sake. It's looking at the rights, the tenure rights also around land. The United States, we're blessed with contract law, but you start to get outside the United States and we've got different tenure issues that we have to deal with, and indigenous issues. But the rights of nature is probably a couple decades out, to be honest, in terms of where it's going. But it's part of that. This is what's ultimately, at least in my view, that's happening, is that we're giving capitalism a heart and conservation a purpose. And as that intersection happens over time, we're going to get into these issues of nature rights. And I would be remiss if I didn't say this. If you want to read the first ever U.S. statement on conservation, without using the word conservation, ever in the United States, go read James Madison's address called On the Symmetry of Nature. And he gave this address to the Albemarle Agricultural Society in 1818. And when you read it, and the issues of soil conservation and dealing with our forest, it's the same issues, different vernacular at the time. But this is a journey that we're on. And what's exciting is that we're on it. And it's going to take time, and it's not something that's going to happen overnight. But the rights of nature is definitely something that's coming.
I have a couple points, and it actually touches on that really great first question about the value of the Amazon data centers, and the point being a very important point. Sometimes policy has to come into play. And that has always been a bit of the concern from the conservation side. When you put a price tag on nature, that doesn't it give somebody an opportunity to give you $1 more for that location? And so policy does become very important. And rights for nature are also, that idea is taking hold, and I think New Zealand has actually implemented some of these ideas as part of a progressive policy initiative to provide those rights. Now, the flip side of that is we have to respect local communities, indigenous use of nature, and as long as those rights for nature work in conjunction with the way traditional communities have been interacting with nature for hundreds and thousands of years, I think we're okay. I'm fully supportive of giving more rights to nature, but we have to recognize how that impacts local communities. 30 by 30 is another great example. It's a great idea, but we always have to be cognizant of the impact on local communities, and that's sort of the flip side of the policy of 30 by 30 is how do you put it into practice? And there's some challenges ahead, but I think ideas of like rights for nature, recognizing environmental injustices and how to fix those can help in all of those areas. And good data analysis.
One of the, speaking, that's a great point, Rob, one of the things that we do is debt for nature swaps. So we reduce, go into countries and we say, okay, we'll forgive your debt if, protect this nature. So we're doing small steps towards that, but it's one example.
Yeah, it's great when it works. If anyone saw it in the New York Times, there was an article about Ecuador a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago. Ecuador had agreed to not drill for oil in some of the rainforests if countries provided, I forget what the number was, $9 billion of financing. It's not really a debt for nature swap, but here we're gonna pay you to not drill. Nobody showed up with the cash, and now they're saying, well, we're gonna drill for oil because we need to set, there's value there. We need to fund our schools and our roads, and they have every right to do that. And so I think we miss an opportunity, and countries like the US and other nations around the world have to step up in this areas.
So we've got an election in Virginia where every member of the General Assembly is going to be up for re-election. It's a great time to make these points broadly in the community that the value of nature has to be part of our future policy. We've got pretty good programs. This area regionally has accomplished about 25% of conservation. Could argue about additional work on restoration to get to the 30 by 30 goals of biodiversity, but the land base is there. But the policy will to go forward with this is at risk. And I'll just tell you from Richmond, senior members of the General Assembly said, haven't we done enough? So we're right at that point where we have to make that public benefit case broadly, loudly for the next 6 months so we can get the support for the structures that make all this possible.
Well, we definitely see this as one example of something we can do to be better informed that this is policy making, decision making, right? It is unfortunate that we need to bring the language that resonates and is typically used in the halls of government agencies beyond the passion, which is often we're almost belittled, right? Oh, you're so passionate about the environment. And you're like, well, because we are dependent upon it, right? But we still sometimes have to talk the language and be able to be more technical about it. And obviously, I think that's what we hope this will help be a little bit of a part of doing.
Just real quick, when policy goes wrong, and I'll give you a great example of misguided policy, and that is the fact that 40% of all soybeans that we grow in the United States goes into biodiesel, and 36% of all corn goes into ethanol. And what we have done for misguided policy is not understood that the industrial appetite for food is greater than the human stomach appetite for food, and it creates a lot of dislocation on the land. And in a high inflationary environment, when the world really is dependent upon the breadbasket of this country to supply corn and soybeans around the world, we cause a lot of global problems when we have that kind of misguided policy.
I want to thank our panel. I'm going to have you guys stay